Hey, Walter Sorrells back with another Pops project of the month. This month, making a forged Bowie. So today I'll be forging a Bowie, or sort of a Bowie adjacent, Bowie-ish kind of knife, and showing off a few pretty cool knife making tools in the process. Now the blade of this knife will be forged from 80 CRV2 steel, and the handle will be made from some big ol' honking blocks of micarta. More on that as we get started. As always, Pop's Project of the Month is sponsored by Pop's Knife Supply, your source for all things knife making. Now, as a general rule, I don't plan out my forged blades too much. I like them to kind of take shape under the hammer. But in this case, I knew first that the handle was going to be somewhat complicated and would really kind of eat up all of the handle material. So I wanted to plan how that handle was going to be laid out, how it was all going to fit together. So it was helpful to get the whole thing in my mind before I actually got started with the hammer. As a result, I drew up a quick plan on Fusion 360 to give me a general sense of what I was shooting for. The basic idea here is to take the traditional Bowie and add some tactical cues in the form of that old standby of high-end tactical knives, black micarta, plus a few other unexpected touches. Should be fun. Alright, let's hit the forge. Like I said earlier, this project is being made with 80 CRV2 steel, a steel that's gotten really popular lately, for good reason. I'll begin by putting a point on the bar of steel, something that many beginners find challenging. This piece of steel was quite a bit larger than I needed, so I'll slim it down a little. I use my hydraulic press to speed up the dumber parts of this process, but there's nothing here that can't be done entirely by hand. The key point here is that if you just forge straight down, the corners will bend together, creating something called fish mouth, which will result in a cold shut. That's basically a crack that you've actually forged into the steel. So care has to be taken here, forging back into each of the little corners to form a good point. This takes quite a bit of effort because this is a pretty stout piece of steel, on top of which 80 CRV2 steel does not move easily under the hammer. Like I said, it's a really nice steel, but it does take some work to bend it to your will. Next, I'll preform the blade and build in the tapers that I need. Boy, that anvil's rocking all over the place. Looks like I need to tighten up my stand a little bit. Once I'm satisfied with the tapers, I'll forge in the bevels. I start at the ricasso, the point where the bevels, that's the knife part of the blade, start. Once you form that little junction in, you want to be very careful to keep the ricasso off the face of the anvil. If you don't, you'll end up forging a twist into the blade or even pushing the entire bevel off to one side like a Japanese sushi knife. That's fine for a sushi knife, but not for a knife like this. Here I'm just evening things up and making some very subtle last-minute adjustments to the shape of the blade. Now for the tang. I'm using a cool little tool here, a guillotine fullering or shouldering tool that I made myself, which fits in the hardy hole of the anvil. You can forge the shoulder of your tang with a hammer, but frankly, it's a lot easier using a tool like this. I like to leave a little extra ricasso so I have plenty to work with later. Now I'll cut off the excess with another hardy tool. And then forge the rest of the tang. Again, leaving plenty to spare. Always better to cut off excess than to come up short. And there's our blade. Hey, let me jump in here to give a shout out to our sponsor, Pop's Knife Supply, your source for everything in the world of knife making, steel for both stock removal guys and hammer bangers, a huge supply of handle materials including all kinds of woods, bone, horn, antler, and tons of cool micarta, including Pop's specialty vintage micarta, plus all sorts of abrasives, including every kind of belt you can think of, sandpaper, specialty abrasives, fasteners, tools, several of which you've seen on this show, you name it. Now, if you live in the Southeast and you haven't visited their amazing new retail location just outside Atlanta, you don't know what you're missing. popsknife.supplies. After normalizing 3 times, I'll take the blade out to the grinder. First, I'll true it up and remove some scale using the surface grinding attachment on my grinder. As is almost always true, this is something you can do using less tool-intensive methods, but this just speeds things up a little. For instance, using this little tool, which I happen to make for the guys at Pops. Ton of great uses for this magnetic blade holding tool. This is just one of them. Next, grinding the bevels. I tend to grind freehand, but there are plenty of good arguments for using a jig. A grinding jig is just a little fixture that allows you to hold your blade at a specific angle, which especially helps beginners master what is one of the most challenging parts of knife making, grinding the bevels. They're also useful in a production environment for speeding up grinding. This particular tool, the Black Dragon jig, is an ingenious model sold by Pops. You can adjust the angle and mount the blade in endless numbers of configurations. There are threaded holes all over it, just very versatile yet easy to use jig. Not room enough to describe everything about it right here, but I'll probably show more details in another video. Okay, so eventually I'll move up to higher grits. I'll finish preliminary shaping by filing a shoulder on the ricasso. This is a nice filing jig that allows me to make it super flat and clean. The goal here is to make the guard to blade fit so that it just disappears into the knife. Any inconsistency here and it'll show up as an ugly gap, so patience is key. And now we're ready to heat treat. After an application of anti-scale compound, I'll quench it in Parks 50 quenching oil. 80 CRV2 is a pretty forgiving steeled heat treat, so it comes out nice and hard on the first shot. Tempered twice at 350 degrees, then to the grinding jig and we'll clean up the bevels. At this point, I also decided the knife was thicker than I wanted, so I thinned it out a little. And we're ready for the handle. We're making a multi-part handle from these big honking pieces of micarta. Again, I want to do this fairly carefully, so I'll use the pattern I made to figure out exactly how everything's oriented. Whacking them up on the bandsaw. We'll also be accenting the handle with vulcanized spacer material, so I'll get that prepared too. It would be normal on a Bowie to have a metal guard, typically brass, but it could be anything really, steel, Damascus, nickel, silver, whatever. But I'll be doing my guard from black micarta. Here we go with the tactical theme. You could argue it's more just part of the handle than a guard, but whatever you call it, I'll actually be making it using the exact same techniques as I would with a metal guard. Now the big challenge here, hollowing out the handle. The least tool-intensive way to do this is to drill out a series of holes, then using files, small saws, and broaches, whittle away the interior material till you get a cavity that will fit the tang. But believe me, I would rather do it this way. Using a mill, I'll mill out the pockets for the tang, orienting everything carefully so they'll be in the right place and won't cut through the handle. Similar techniques with the guard in this case, though I'll use a smaller 1/8 inch end mill to mill out a slightly undersized slot. We want to have to literally force this down onto the tang for an ultra tight clean fit to the ricasso. Too fat, you can't get it down, or else it'll crack the micarta. Too wide, and you'll have a gap. As a result, I'm milling the slot about 2 or 3 thousandths of an inch smaller than the tang. With a reasonably flexible material like micarta, this should be just exactly right. I'll glue up the handle in several stages. First, the guard section goes on. Perfect tight fit. Preliminary gluing of the rest, making sure to clean and degrease all the surfaces beforehand. Now, FYI, the reason for pre-assembly is that grinding these interior curves the way I'm doing them would basically be impossible once the blade's assembled. Otherwise, I'd assemble the entire handle at one throw. Then the final glue up. And there we go, ready for finishing the handle. I'll begin by thinning and tapering the handle so it flares towards the end. Then rounding things off a little. Now smoothing out all the lines. Grinding and blending the interior or bottom surfaces of the handle requires very flexible J-weight belts. In this case, Pops has supplied me with these scalloped edge belts. If you're having trouble gouging or nicking or otherwise bollocksing up the interiors of bird's beak handles, guards, and other interior curves, you gotta try these. They're lifesavers. You can see I'm getting inside a really tight corner here with this 1-inch wide scallop belt, and it really cleans up nicely. A little hand sanding. And a little buffing. And there we have it. A very complicated but very satisfying project. By the way, I should mention that if you like the looks of this blade, you can pick it up at my website, tacticsarmory.com. They tend to go within a few hours, so check the website as soon as you can. Alright guys, I hope you had as much fun as I did with this build. Always remember that if you find a challenge in knife making that's getting you frustrated, there's a good chance that some clever knife maker out there has figured out a tool to make that particular job easier. Witness this tool right here, this cool little tool right here, the grinding jig that we used, many others that I showed today, and most of them you can track down at Pops. Thanks for checking out this month's Pops Project of the Month, and keep on making those knives. Thanks for watching, guys. If you like what we're doing here, please subscribe and make sure that you click on that bell so you get notified of all the latest videos. Want to buy a knife from me? Check out my modern blades at tacticsarmory.com. Digging the channel? You can support our video making efforts on Patreon. You know, I've been banging away on these videos for like 10 years, so I hope you'll show some love for all that hard work. Link in the cards and descriptions. Finally, if you're interested in making Japanese swords, check out my full line of Japanese sword videos where I show how to forge Japanese swords as well as how to polish them and how to make fittings, handles, and scabbards. Walter Sorrells Blades.com.